Professor Cheeseman from the University of Birmingham, Professor of Democracy. And thank you so much for joining us today for a little chat about hopefully the future of democracy and what we can expect regarding current events and more sort of broadly as well in terms of the future. So we can get started. So the first sort of question we wanted to tackle was more broadly if you think we're seeing a backsliding in democracy. And I was wondering if we could sort of tackle that from your research, if you see it in any particular states or regions, in any sort of types of development, if you're seeing it in both underdeveloped and developed states, or if it's more of a trend in newer democracies or older democracies. What's the sort of trends that are going on currently? Or is it happening at all?
That's a great question. I mean, I've written a lot, as have a lot of other people, about the kind of risks during the pandemic. Yeah. We have a COVID-19 context, and in that context, governments get to assume more powers, often legitimately, because they need to keep us safe and they need to impose restrictions on our movements. But those powers can often be manipulated, and we've seen a lot of concern that in countries like Hungary, instead of giving a proportionate amount of extra power to the government, really we've seen changes that just give, in that case, the Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, great powers to be able to not only do things that previously would have been impossible, but also a lack of limits on that. So instead of saying this ends after 6 months or this ends when judges decide that the situation is no longer appropriate, the changes that have taken place in Hungary have empowered him until the situation is deemed to be over, but he's been given the power to deem the situation to be over. So effectively a kind of grant of significant more power that he could use over a long period of time. And in a number of countries, particularly in places where democracy is fragile, so some countries in Latin America, some countries in sub-Saharan Africa, that also have been concerned that governments attempting to keep a tight narrative on what's happening with COVID-19 and whether or not they're being successful in managing COVID-19 have effectively censored the press, and that's included the harassment of journalists. But that process, which has happened under the pandemic, hasn't, of course, happened in isolation. And in fact, if we'd have been having this conversation last year, we'd have been talking about similar concerns, not so much related to the pandemic itself, but a kind of gradual decline in democracy over a number of years that's been picked up by many different democracy ratings, organizations and groups that appears to be a combination of things. In some countries or some regions, we seem to have new democracies that have either kind of hit a plateau or are moving back slightly towards their old authoritarian selves. In other places, say Europe and North America, where we think of historically democracy being more established, we've seen real concerns about the quality of that democracy, especially, of course, under the leadership of somebody like Donald Trump in the United States. And, of course, those two things are connected in the sense that the decreasing focus on democracy under, say, Boris Johnson in the UK, but also someone like Trump in America, has also sent a signal to leaders of the rest of the world that perhaps the international community, by which in this sense, I guess we're talking about the kind of Western countries that might traditionally have supported democracy around the world, aren't going to emphasize that so much. And of course, that sends a message around the world that maybe you can get away with being a bit less democratic than you could do before. So the pandemic context is actually playing into a much longer term process, which is worrying. But I think it's also important to bring a note of positivity. Right? And while all of that is true, it's also true that as we speak, we see a major uprising in Belarus against Europe's kind of last dictator, Lukashenko. We see massive protests and a big Twitter campaign around Zimbabwe and Lives Matter, campaigning against corruption and the abuse of power under the ZANU-PF regime in Zimbabwe. We have also seen mass protests in Mali. Those have triggered a coup, which might, be problematic in the long term in terms of democracy. But there was an upsurge of popular opinion and resistance to what was seen to be an unpopular and undemocratic leader. So at the same time as we have those great concerning cases, we also have cases where we perhaps might see democratization occurring in a way as a flip of what's happening with coronavirus. So in those cases, I think one of what's happening is that basically people have become economically really hurt by the virus, the virus has really exposed the government's failings, and along with a history of grievances against the regime, that's built into more effective and more powerful protest movements that have really taken people onto the streets. We see similar thing happening in Lebanon in response to the big explosion there. Mm-hmm. So what we might see actually during the pandemic is a number of countries really moving back towards authoritarianism, but we might see a number of other countries that are actually having really big, important democratic breakthroughs. Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that we often don't think about, that sometimes the really big improvements in some states and the really big declines in other states mean that kind of globally, perhaps we actually average out. And the decline in democracy might not be simply one way. There might be some green shoots coming as well.
Right. Do you think those that have declined, such as Hungary, if we draw on the Hungary example, do you think they're likely to continue, or do you think that they will reach a limit potentially? Is coronavirus sort of distracting the world at the moment from those serious issues, and once that's sort of settled down, will countries be able to revert back to addressing those issues, or do you think they'll sort of be able to continue on the tangent that they're already on?
That's a really good question. I mean, there's certainly some ways in which COVID-19 has made things much more complicated. For example, it's hard to send election observers to an election now because, travel restrictions, quarantine restrictions means it might just be unfeasible. It would be very difficult for Western leaders to take time off from dealing with the pandemic domestically to fight for democracy globally. That might go down badly with their own publics who expect them to be at home rather than abroad right now. So there's lots of different ways in which this might work. It's also harder to get international leaders together. It might be more difficult to organize major summits to actually talk about democracy and protecting democracy. So all of those things I think are true. And all of those things do mean that at the minute it's perhaps harder to protect and defend democracy than it has been for a while. Mm-hmm. It's also true, of course, that the COVID restrictions mean that civil society groups and opposition parties can't do what they might have done in the past, i.e. go to the streets and have rallies, especially against the regime, because, of course, those things are banned because social distancing is enforced. Yeah. So both domestically and internationally, we could be said to be in a kind of worst-case scenario right now, a perfect storm.
Right.
In that sense, yes, once we move out of the crisis, we might expect to see more movement. And we've seen a number of leaders within the European Union be very critical of Hungary and say that Hungary needs to come back towards democracy to maintain its role within Europe, and that if Hungary doesn't want to have penalties and sanctions, etc., it needs to correct its course of action. And so we might expect that to become a bigger issue once the crisis is over. I think the one caveat to that, though, and it kind of goes back to what we were talking about just a moment ago, is that actually, this isn't simply caused by the pandemic. We've seen, some would say, a kind of malaise in international commitment to democracy over the last 5 to 10 years. This didn't just start with Boris Johnson and Donald Trump. Some people would say, in fact, it started with Barack Obama, who, for all of people's excitement of having a leader with connections to Africa, because of his ties to Kenya, actually didn't have a particularly exciting or dynamic plan for Africa, didn't really do that much to promote democracy on the continent. More than Trump, perhaps, but not what people might have expected or hoped for. And of course, UK being involved in Brexit and becoming to some extent more insular as a result of that was in a way, moving away from making big commitments to democracy around the world well before Boris Johnson took power. So while I do think the situation will be different after COVID, and I do think there'll be more pushback, both domestically and internationally, I don't think we should necessarily expect things to be reversed back very quickly in the countries in which we're talking about, particularly in somewhere like Hungary. I mean, the other thing we have to keep in mind in Hungary is that opinion polls suggested that the Prime Minister's move to basically take this power was legitimate in the sense that it was approved of by most of the people. Now, we might think that the people were in that position because they were worried about COVID. And they might have been in that position because they've been duped by a leader who's told them that it's going to be in their interests. And they haven't perhaps heard as much as they should have done from opposition leaders and society groups about the problems of these kinds of powers. But it's still significant that, of course, if a leader like that can actually persuade people that not only should he have more power, but that him having more power is the best thing for them, then it becomes quite difficult to reverse that situation. And I think here Belarus is really instructive. In Belarus, the international community did not come out and protest after the election results. They came out and protested after the Belarusian people came out and protested. And one of the things that the international community was saying is there shouldn't be human rights abuses committed against the protesters. But it took the protesters to go to the streets for the international community to wake up and say, there's a moment here that's important and we need to engage.
Right.
I think if we hadn't seen those protests on the streets, the international community would have sat on their hands. They would have said it wasn't a good quality election, but they wouldn't have done anything about it. They wouldn't have condemned it. They wouldn't have called Lukashenko a dictator. Right. None of the language and statements that are being made now would have been made now. So, in other words, what we really need to see if we want to reverse things that have happened in places like Hungary is domestic civil society needs to mobilize, go to the streets, take the opposition, raise the issue, put pressure on the regime. That's the moment that the international community will then engage. That then creates a major situation, a major event. The media will then engage, and that's a moment in which you can really then start to leverage that pressure to push back and, for example, reduce the powers of political leaders.
Right.
But it very rarely happens without that domestic international nexus, and that's one of the things that's missing at the minute.
In regards to the situation in Belarus, when it comes to the international community, is there a concern around Belarus with the involvement of who has more influence on Belarus's politics, the EU and Western international community, or Russia?
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that's been playing out over the last few years is that both the sort of East and West have been trying to lure Lukashenko. Russia wants to see Belarus as, a sort of former territory, an outpost of Russian influence. The West wants to bring it into the heart of Europe and convert it over time into a capitalist democracy. And that tension has been there over the last few years, and that's clearly playing out in the crisis now. When Western powers criticize Lukashenko for the election rigging and the human rights abuses, he then goes to Russia and says, they want regime change, they want to get me out, NATO's doing things at the border, I need Russian troops to come in and save me. Putin then makes statements about regime change agents and the West trying to become involved. Right. And then we get into a really big situation where it actually looks like the international community might resolve this rather than it being a domestic solution. And of course, what we know in Belarus is actually this process has happened because ordinary citizens have gone to the streets and risked their lives to protest against an authoritarian regime. And they're not doing it because the West told them, and those who are resisting aren't really doing it because the Russians told them. This is a domestic situation. So the best thing that the international community can do in Belarus in some ways is actually not do anything. Right? It's really important that the West doesn't make this look like their transition, that they're sponsoring this process, because that would actually delegitimate what's going on in the country. Also really important, of course, that Putin and Russia don't send lots of troops into Belarus to effectively undermine the country's sovereignty and repress the protests, because that, of course, would also be an unwarranted international intervention. Interestingly, at the minute, Putin's playing it quite carefully, although he said that he might provide support for Lukashenko if there was an incursion by the West. He's also not really done anything so far to do so. So it's quite interesting to see both the West and Russia kind of sitting on the fence a little bit right now. But there is a really big danger, as in Ukraine, that this becomes an internationalized crisis and that sucks in global powers, and that then the prospects for a domestic process and negotiated transition go out of the window.
Right, okay. When bringing up the West, often I think it's when discussing election rigging and fraudulent votes and other such authoritarian measures around elections, we often talk about potentially or think of underdeveloped states, and less so the USA. However, currently under the current administration, there is some sort of alarming reports coming where there are some people who indicate that potentially voter suppression is going to occur in the US in terms of, in particular, in-mail voting or tampering. How do you view what's happening in the US at the moment?
Well, I think we have a president in the US who is reverting to a very classic authoritarian type.
Right.
And it's the leader who thinks he might lose the election, so he starts discrediting the election before it's been held.
Right.
And we warned against this. If people are interested, we published a piece in the Washington Post, in the Monkey Case section of the Washington Post, maybe a month, 6 weeks ago now, saying that exactly this was going to happen. That what Trump was going to try and do was discredit the election. Why? Well, two reasons to discredit the election ahead of it. One, if you then lose the election, you can claim you didn't lose because you were unpopular and unsuccessful, because you were, basically ripped off, you were cheated. And then you can say to your supporters, hey, still support me because it wasn't my fault. It's not like I'm a failure.
Right.
But two, of course, if you can claim the election was rigged, then you can give yourself a reason for staying in power, even though you lost the election. You can claim that the Electoral Commission should somehow recount the votes. You can try and force the court to allow you to stay in power by pointing to irregularities and so on. Right. And we've seen that in some elections in Latin America and Africa, where leaders who are losing miraculously turn around and allege the opposition rigged the election, even though, of course, the government is mostly in control of the electoral process. So Trump has started using this strategy, and the really big question for us is how far is he willing to go with this strategy? So he's alleging that, basically the election might be rigged through the postal vote. Mm-hmm. But as a classic populist, he's also put his own guy in charge of the postal system. Mm-hmm. And his own guy is now accused of trying to hamper the way the postal system works so that postal votes don't get counted properly. Right. So we have a really interesting kind of classic populist situation where the leader tries to assert control over an institution at the same time as accusing that same institution of undermining their opportunities and being rigged against them. So kind of almost using rhetoric as a deliberate subterfuge, whilst at the same time kind of manipulate the institutions, the same institution that's being attacked. Right. For its lack of independence. The big question, as I say, then, is what? How far is Trump willing to push that? Mm-hmm. Is he willing to actually use his influence within the postal system to try and stop votes going out on time and use that as a way of claiming that the election is not credible? Is he willing to actually try and declare that he's won the election? So one of the danger signs, I think, for a lot of people is that we could be in a situation where postal votes are still being counted while we have the vote on the day. And the vote on the day might say something that postal votes won't say. So perhaps it's possible that Trump will somehow squeeze home with a victory while there's still postal votes to be counted. Right. Will Trump then say postal votes are illegitimate, I'm going to declare myself president and get on with business, and then put America's democratic institutions in a really difficult position where they would actually have to go against the president and say, no, we must protect the postal vote, etc. So I think all of these are the really big questions that Trump's behavior kind of throws up. Mm-hmm. Will he find a way or try and find a way of declaring himself to have won the election and use postal votes somehow as, either a kind of excuse or as a way of kind of discounting certain votes that he doesn't think are going to be for him? And if he can do that, then he could polarize the political system in a really dangerous way in America that perhaps we haven't seen in our lifetimes. And one of the things that's really interesting about America, and the reason I like your question, is that we tend to assume that the institutions we see in Western democracies are robust. The legislature is powerful. The president can be held to account. The Constitution is strong. And what Trump has shown us is that actually a lot of those things look that way because presidents essentially respected the rules. Right. They tried to follow the rules. They followed the informal unwritten rules as well as the formal written rules. And it looked like the presidents were very constrained. All of a sudden, when we got Trump and we started to see Trump misbehaving, we realized that a lot of what we kind of thought was set in stone was kind of convention. It was informal. It actually didn't have to be done. Mm-hmm. And actually some of the institutions turned out to be weaker than we thought. For example, I don't think many of us thought that the Republican Party would support Trump doing what he's now doing, and in so doing undermine Congress as a check and balance against Trump's power. And yet the Republican Party has effectively gone along with it, and therefore the legislature has not acted as the check on the abuse of power that in the ideal system of the checks and balances of the US political system would have happened. So all of a sudden, Trump is making us really rethink and reevaluate what we know about Western democracies and how strong they are and how institutionalized they are. And I think to some extent, a similar thing is happening in some European countries where we also see the rise of populist leaders. And of course, in Brazil, which we thought of as being a vibrant Latin American democracy, Bolsonaro, another right-wing populist, all of a sudden the checks and balances again seem less strong than they did maybe 2 or 3 years ago. Mm-hmm. So I think there is a really big question here, both about the US election and what will Trump attempt to do in that election, mm-hmm. but also more broadly, are the Western democracies that we've been so complacent about actually are so strong and institutionalized? Or do we actually need to think about a process of democratic renewal in those countries?
Right. In regards to the populist Western governments that we've seen as of late, including Brazil as well, how do you think coronavirus has impacted people's trust in such governments? Do you think people who've previously supported populist regimes have sort of seen that potentially they are not quite as good at governing as they might be at campaigning? Or do you think potentially the sort of anti-expert rhetoric has gone too far and that people are quite content and to trust their own governments at this time?
It's a really good question. I think, first thing to say is that I think in general, probably on average, democracies have performed better than authoritarian states when it comes to coronavirus. But some authoritarian states and some democracies have done well, and some authoritarian states and some democracies have done badly. Right. To me, the really strong pattern is that the populists have done badly. Yeah. So what's less important is democracy versus authoritarianism. What's more important is the populism of the leader, because the populist leaders tended to buy into the conspiracy theories. They tended not to trust experts. They tended not to invest in health systems. They tended not to want to put in place unpopular policies because, of course, they're populists. And so this isn't just the US. This isn't just Brazil, although we've seen, people dying in both of those countries because of this. Right. It's also places like Tanzania, places like Madagascar, where presidents basically said, we don't really believe in this. These are often evangelical presidents or presidents who have a deep belief in religion, right, who refuse to close churches because they felt that the power of God would be stronger than the power of coronavirus. Not always, but in some cases. Yeah. There's sometimes leaders who touted their own miracle cure. Of course, Trump did that, to sort of comical, tragic effect in America. Mm-hmm. But in Madagascar, we also had a leader who came up with his own cure and actually exported it to other countries in Africa. Right. And I think these are the countries, and Belarus, of course, another one, and Turkmenistan, I think, where basically leaders significantly downplayed the significance of coronavirus, and as a result, their countries were hit much harder than other countries. And in those countries, I do think it's had an impact. I think the protests we see in Belarus, for example, are partly a product of that. But I don't think that's the whole story, because as you hinted towards the end, actually a lot of the population of some of these countries have been, to a greater or lesser extent, indoctrinated into the president's worldview. Mm-hmm. So Trump supporters, even though they might see that Trump hasn't performed well, don't seem to want to punish him in the same way that non-Trump supporters are punishing him for his poor performance. No. The same in Brazil, that yes, I think, opposition supporters, swing voters are punishing Bolsonaro for his poor performance, but his own supporters might not be punishing him in the same way because they're still buying into the rhetoric and the language, etc., that he's using. So I think you're right. I mean, in a lot of the countries that we're now talking about, we're not talking about one public that has one set of views and interprets information in the same way. We're talking about two or three publics, often, that interpret news and information not necessarily on the basis of how factual it is, but in part on the basis of their ideological lenses and their prior assumptions before they hear the information. And for those groups in America, the Trumpites, they don't seem to be, as significantly impacted by this as others. Mm-hmm. And I think that is, this is one of the things that, of course, a lot of us have been concerned about when it comes to social media, that the existence of social media allows these sort of parallel and sort of distinct media networks to take place, where people are only getting information from certain types of places. And actually, some of the research we've had recently suggests that some of those concerns are overblown. Social media isn't as much of an echo chamber as people once thought. There's a lot of evidence that people aren't only talking to people of their own political persuasion. Yeah. But it's nonetheless true that the ability of the traditional media to cut through the debate and say, this is the truth, you need to do this, seems to have been significantly reduced. And, the most sad and horrifying examples of that are, the Americans who have died or their partners who have died having contracted coronavirus because they either believed it was all a hoax or they believed that the fear was overblown, because what sort of traditional media was telling them wasn't winning them or persuading them over. They were listening more to the conspiracy theory take. And I think that's something that's really important going forwards. Yeah. Because if we can't persuade people to do very basic things like take healthcare preparations seriously during a global pandemic, what else might we struggle to persuade people it's really important for them to do? And of course, one of those things is vaccinations. And I think one of the things we need to really worry about is the sort of intersection between the anti-vaccination movement and campaign, populist leaders, and sort of social media.
Right.
Because, of course, if we start to see an increasing number of people not wanting their children to be vaccinated in the kinds of countries we're talking about, not only does that have implications right now in terms of, coronavirus vaccine, but that has implications 10, 15 years down the line in terms of communities that haven't been properly inoculated against a range of diseases. Right. So, this really is a big, important question about trust. How do you build trust in government? How do you rebuild trust in traditional media? How do you encourage people to fact check and really think about the kind of information they're using? And how do you break through that wall when people are seeing traditional media, they are seeing the official government messages, but they're simply disbelieving them or not taking them seriously enough?
Right.